London, 1891, the season every debutante dreamed of and one girl feared most. For Lady Isabella Hawthorne, the night of her wedding should have been a coronation of joy. Instead, it was an execution of duty. Beneath the brilliance of crystal chandeliers and the hush of 1,000 silken gowns, she stood beside a man whose touch was colder than the marble floor beneath them. Prince Arthur of Wales, heir to the English throne, adored by the public and haunted by the memory of another woman. His smile, courteous and distant, did not reach his eyes when he placed the ring upon her trembling hand. He had not looked at her once during the ceremony. The priest's words, echoing through St. James's Chapel, felt like a requiem rather than a blessing. When the final amen fell into silence, Arthur turned slightly, not toward his bride, but toward the grand doors where the Queen's ministers awaited his exit. He offered Isabella his arm only because custom demanded it. She took it with quiet grace, aware that the entire court watched for the smallest fracture in her poise. The whispers began before the vows had settled. She was chosen, not cherished. The prince mourns another. Poor girl, a crown without affection. Each word clung to her as she walked down the aisle, her ivory gown rustling like paper through the air heavy with expectation. The scent of roses, imported from Windsor, mixed with the sting of candle smoke. By the time she reached the palace that night, her head ached from the weight of both her tiara and the silence that followed her everywhere. At the wedding banquet, laughter rang from every corner but the head table. Arthur sat rigid, his glass untouched. When the orchestra began a waltz, the same melody played at his first love's debut, he rose abruptly. "I must attend to matters of the council," he said, his tone even, his eyes fixed on no one. The room fell into a stunned stillness. Isabella remained seated, her hands folded neatly on her lap, as the man who was now her husband left her surrounded by strangers. The Duchess of Marlborough leaned toward her neighbor. "How tragic," she murmured behind a painted fan, "to wed a ghost still in mourning." Isabella heard. She smiled faintly as though the comment were beneath her notice, though inside she felt something within her unravel, not her pride, but her belief that kindness could soften cruelty. Hours later, as the guests dispersed and the chandeliers dimmed to pale amber, a lady-in-waiting approached. "His Highness has ordered your belongings to be placed in the East Wing, Your Grace." The East Wing. Isabella repeated softly. It was an older part of the palace, cold and seldom visited. She nodded once, concealing the slight tremor in her voice. "Very well." The corridors stretched endlessly as she walked, her slippers whispering against stone floors polished to reflection. Portraits of past queens lined the walls, women whose faces bore the same mixture of grace and resignation. The servant carrying her train stumbled slightly on a loose rug, and Isabella murmured a gentle "thank you" when the girl steadied it again. Even in solitude, she clung to courtesy, it was the only armor she possessed. Her chamber was modest compared to the grandeur she had left behind. The fireplace sputtered weakly, and the faint scent of damp hung in the air. On the dressing table sat a single candle and a vase of winter lilies, their petals already beginning to curl at the edges. Someone had left them there, perhaps out of pity. She undid her tiara, setting it beside the flowers. The silence pressed around her, heavier than any gown. From the distant west wing came the faint echo of music, Arthur's world, far removed from hers. She sat before the small mirror, watching the flame tremble as though uncertain whether to live or die. How curious, she thought, that even light hesitated in this room. The hours crawled. Outside, snow began to fall, brushing against the tall windows like ghosts seeking entry. She thought of her father's last words before the wedding. "Remember, Isabella, a crown is not worn for comfort." He had been right. The coronet upon her head might as well have been made of ice. When the maid arrived with her night robe, Isabella thanked her kindly. "If His Highness should inquire after me," she said, "tell him I am grateful for his generosity." The maid looked startled, as if unsure whether gratitude was warranted for abandonment. She tried to sleep, but the hush of the palace carried too many secrets. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind felt like another whisper from the ballroom. He does not love her. She will fade as others have. Near midnight, unable to bear the stillness, she rose and went to the small writing desk by the window. From her sleeve she drew a folded scrap of parchment, the vows she had written herself, never spoken aloud. They were tender, hopeful things now rendered meaningless. She read them once, then carefully tore them in half, the paper sighing softly as it split. Yet even as she dropped the pieces into the fire, something within her refused to die. She would not plead for affection. She would not mirror his bitterness. If this palace was to be her prison, She would fill it with grace until even its walls remembered her kindness. A sudden knock startled her. The maid reappeared, curtsying hastily. "Forgive me, your grace. A message has been delivered from the west wing." "For me?" "Yes, my lady. It bears the royal seal." Isabella's pulse quickened, perhaps a note of apology, a word to bridge the distance between them. She broke the wax with care. Inside was a letter addressed not to her, but to His Royal Highness Prince Arthur of Wales. The crest embossed upon the corner gleamed faintly under candlelight, an intertwined E and A. Evangeline. Her name had been whispered often enough through the corridors that Isabella recognized the emblem at once, the mark of the woman Arthur had loved before the crown forbade their union. The maid waited uncertainly. "Shall I send it on, my lady?" For a moment Isabella could not speak. The words on the page were not hers to read, yet the mere presence of that letter in her hands was enough to strip away the fragile hope she had nursed since morning. She sealed it again and passed it back. "Yes. Deliver it to His Highness. At once." When the door closed behind her, Isabella sank into the chair, her breath shallow, her composure barely intact. Outside, snow thickened, cloaking the city in silence. The fire burned low, casting uneven shadows across the walls, her only witnesses. She told herself she would not cry. But as the candle guttered and the wind moaned through the chimneys, one tear fell anyway, not of heartbreak but of quiet surrender. Far across the palace, unseen, a servant handed the letter to the prince. Arthur glanced at the seal and his jaw tightened. Without opening it, he slipped it into the drawer beside his bed. Neither knew that by dawn, that unopened letter would change everything. 3 weeks after the wedding, the kingdom's newspapers began printing what the courtiers dared not say aloud. "A union of convenience, not of companionship," one headline read. Another, crueler still, "The prince's heart lies buried with another." The ink was barely dry before whispers turned into weapons, slicing through every corridor of Buckingham like invisible blades. Lady Isabella read none of them. She did not need to. The servants carried the tone of the papers in their glances, sympathetic, cautious, a touch of pity mingled with curiosity. Pity was the one expression she could not bear. So she spent her mornings tending to the palace's neglected gardens, her gloves stained with soil, her breath white against the frosted air. The gardeners, and used to royal company, watched in silent awe as the young princess knelt among the roses, pruning dead stems with the precision of a surgeon. "Your grace should not trouble herself," one murmured. "I am not troubled," she replied quietly, clipping another wilted bloom. "Only waiting for something to grow." But growth came slow in winter, and slower still in a marriage built on duty. Prince Arthur had not spoken to her since the night of the wedding. Their meals were taken separately, their lives divided by both distance and pride. He buried himself in matters of state, appearing each morning in Parliament with the same austere dignity that once charmed the nation. To the public he remained the perfect heir. Only Isabella knew how hollow that perfection sounded when echoed through the palace walls. Still she kept her grace intact. Each evening she wrote letters to her father, letters she never sent, describing a happiness she did not possess. She knew he would worry otherwise. "I am content," she would write. "The prince is kind." The lies were gentle ones, told for love rather than deceit. It was on a gray afternoon in February that the first true wound struck. The royal household hosted a small council banquet, meant to display unity between the new couple and the crown's advisors. Isabella arrived precisely at 7, her gown pale blue silk trimmed with pearls, her composure flawless. The men stood as she entered, their gestures polished, their smiles thin. At the head of the table sat Arthur, his expression unreadable. The meal unfolded in measured silence until the Duchess of Pembroke, a woman known for her barbed tongue, turned to her neighbor and said, loudly enough for half the room to hear, "It must be strange for her grace, wearing another woman's jewels." The remark landed like a slap. Isabella glanced instinctively at the pendant resting against her collarbone, a delicate sapphire encircled by silver filigree. It had been found in her chamber's drawer, left without explanation. She had assumed it belonged to the royal collection. Arthur's fork stilled midair. The room waited for his reply. He looked at Isabella, then at the Duchess, his gaze cool but steady. "You are mistaken, madam," he said evenly. "That pendant belonged to my late mother. Her Highness wears it at my request." A lie, spoken not in cruelty but protection. The Duchess faltered, murmured an apology and turned her eyes to her plate. Conversation resumed, brittle and forced. Isabella said nothing. Gratitude tangled with confusion in her chest. He had defended her, Yet why after weeks of silence? When the dinner ended, Arthur rose first. "You have conducted yourself with grace," he said quietly as they left the hall. "The court will remember that." "Grace is all I have left, Your Highness," she replied, her voice steady though her heart trembled. He paused, as if her words had unsettled something long dormant within him. Then, without another glance, he disappeared into the west wing once more. That night, unable to sleep, Isabella walked the corridor outside her chamber, her slippers whispering against the carpet. She paused before a window overlooking the frost-touched gardens. Beneath the moonlight, the flowers she had tended still refused to bloom. She thought of Arthur's lie, how it had shielded her, and wondered whether kindness could exist without affection. A faint sound behind her made her turn. The young maid who often attended her stood there, nervous and pale. "Forgive me, my lady," she said, curtsying quickly. "There's talk among the servants. The court believes His Highness only defended you to protect the crown's dignity. They say that I am his burden?" Isabella finished gently. The girl nodded, ashamed. "Then let them say it," Isabella murmured. "Even burdens can carry grace." In the following days something shifted, almost imperceptibly, like the air before a storm. Arthur began to appear more frequently in the east wing. Once she caught him lingering outside the library where she practiced the pianoforte. He did not enter but listened a moment before walking away. Another evening, when she returned from the gardens, she found a book of poetry left on her desk. Tennyson, bound in leather, his name inscribed faintly on the inside cover. He had said nothing, but the gesture lingered like the warmth of a fading fire. Then came the morning she collapsed. The palace accountant had resigned unexpectedly, and the charities under the royal patronage risked losing their funding. Isabella, determined to preserve them, spent 3 sleepless nights balancing the ledgers herself. When she finally rose from her desk, the room tilted. She barely reached the door before darkness claimed her. When she awoke, sunlight streamed through her curtains. Arthur stood beside the bed, his coat unbuttoned, his hair slightly disheveled, a rare imperfection. "You fainted," he said simply. "From exhaustion." She tried to rise, but he motioned her back. "You were working for the charities," he continued. "That was not your burden to bear." "Someone must bear it," she whispered. "Duty does not sleep simply because hearts do." His expression softened, though his voice remained guarded. "You should have asked for help. Would you have offered it?" He did not answer. For the first time, silence between them felt fragile instead of cold. When the physician entered, Arthur stepped back, but not before gently adjusting the blanket at her shoulder. The touch was brief, uncertain, yet it left her breathless. By evening, the entire palace knew the prince had stayed at his wife's bedside. Rumors spread again, but this time they sounded different, curious, hopeful, almost tender. Still, gossip could wound as deeply as silence. The Queen Mother, displeased by the attention, summoned Arthur to her private salon. No one knew what words passed between them, only that his jaw was tight when he emerged. Later that night, as thunder rolled over London, Isabella sat once more at her pianoforte. Her fingers traced the keys without sound, each note imagined rather than played. She thought of the way Arthur had looked at her that morning, not with love, perhaps, but with something that resembled remorse. A door creaked behind her. She turned sharply, expecting the maid, but it was him. "Forgive the intrusion," Arthur said, his tone clipped. "I require a document that may have been sent here by mistake. Concerning the council ledgers." She rose, startled but composed. "Of course. You may search where you please." As he crossed the room, a low rumble of thunder shook the windows. The candle flickered, throwing his shadow across the walls. His eyes fell upon the piano. "You play?" he said quietly. "A little," she replied. "It passes the hours." "What was the melody?" "A song I learned from my governess. She said it was once taught to the royal tutors." His gaze lifted slowly to hers, astonishment flickering through the mask of formality. "I know that song," he said almost to himself. Outside, rain began to fall in earnest, drumming softly against the glass. Neither spoke again. The distance between them, so carefully maintained, trembled like the flame between them. Then, as if fearing his own hesitation, Arthur turned toward the door. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Your Highness." The latch clicked shut behind him, but the echo of that shared melody lingered long after. By morning, every servant in the East Wing noticed something peculiar. For the first time since her arrival, fresh flowers had been placed at Lady Isabella's window, and the order had come from the prince himself. The piano fell silent mid-note, not from hesitation, but from the sudden closing of the door behind him. Arthur had returned. Rain swept in through the open balcony, drenching the drapes until they clung to the window panes like pale ghosts. Isabella rose, startled, her hands trembling above the keys. "Your Highness." He lifted a hand, not in command but in quiet apology. "Forgive me. I did not mean to startle you." I heard the melody again. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it, stripped of authority, nearly human. He stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the carpet as though the threshold between them were sacred ground. The faint scent of rain and tobacco lingered on his coat. "That song," he said, "where did you learn it?" "From my governess years ago. She said it was a favorite of a royal pupil she once taught." Arthur's gaze drifted to the instrument. "That pupil was I." The silence that followed felt like the turning of a page in an unwritten story. Isabella's breath caught, unsure whether to curtsy or to sit, unsure if this moment, so fragile and unplanned, would vanish if she moved too suddenly. "I haven't heard it in 2 decades, he continued quietly. "My tutor played it the night before my father died. He said the melody would remind me that sorrow and beauty are often siblings." Her voice barely carried. "Then I am sorry to have summoned ghosts." He shook his head. "You did not summon them. You soothed them." For the first time he looked at her without distance. It was not admiration nor pity, but recognition. The kind one offers to another survivor of the same quiet war. "Why do you play alone?" he asked. "Because silence can be cruel," she said simply. "And I would rather fill it with something that listens back." His expression faltered, and she sensed the crack in his composure before he did. "I have been unkind," he said at last. "You did not deserve it. You did what you believed necessary. That is not forgiveness. It is understanding," she replied. He looked down as if the carpet held the answers his heart refused to give. "When I was told I must marry again, I thought obedience would shield me. But every vow spoken for duty becomes a lie told to oneself. I could not bear another lie. And so you punished me for the truth of your grief," she said softly. The words struck him like a confession. "You are braver than I imagined. I am only surviving, Your Highness. That is all women in my position have ever done." He stepped closer, and for a heartbeat, the distance that had defined their marriage seemed almost conquerable. "How do you endure the gossip?" he asked. "The stares, the pity?" "By remembering that pity cannot harm what grace protects." He exhaled, half in disbelief, half in awe. "You speak of grace as if it were armor." "It is," she said. "But it is also a wound. The more one bears it, the deeper it cuts." A gust of wind slammed against the windows, scattering rain across the floor. Arthur crossed to the balcony, shut the doors and stood there for a moment, his silhouette framed against the storm. "When I lost Evangeline," he murmured, "I thought grief would make me noble. Instead it made me cruel." "You loved her deeply?" "I loved her selfishly," he said, turning back. "I thought the world owed me happiness for losing her. It did not. And so, when they brought me to you, I decided I would owe the world nothing, least of all kindness." She studied him, her heart tightening not from jealousy, but from the strange compassion born of truth shared too late. "And do you still believe that?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No. Not anymore." For a long moment neither spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock, a steady reminder that even time bowed to silence when words carried weight. At last he said, "You are unlike anyone at court, Lady Isabella." She smiled faintly. "That is what they say when they cannot decide whether to admire or condemn." His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile but its distant cousin. Perhaps both. The tension between them shifted, no longer hostility, not yet tenderness. Something fragile and unnamed hovered in the air. She felt it in the way his gaze lingered, in the hesitation before he turned away. "May I ask you something, Your Highness?" He nodded. "When you defended me at the banquet, why did you lie?" He looked at her, startled. "Would you rather I hadn't?" "I would rather have known the reason." He drew a slow breath. "Because the truth, that the pendant belonged to Evangeline, would have humiliated you. I have caused you enough of that already." Her eyes softened. "Then thank you, though the kindness came late." He moved to the pianoforte, resting one gloved hand on the polished wood. "You play with restraint," he said, as though afraid to be heard. "Because music, like affection, invites interruption." He met her gaze again and for the first time did not look away. "And yet I interrupted you." "Perhaps," she said, her voice a whisper, "because you wished to listen." The air thickened with something unsaid, not passion but its precursor, understanding. Arthur's hand brushed the keys. One note trembled into the room, pure and uncertain. When my tutor played this, he said, I was a boy who believed kings could command the world to love them. Now I know love commands kings. She watched him as one watches light fall through a window, wary of its transience. Then perhaps love will yet forgive you, your highness. Forgive me, he echoed. For mistaking silence for strength. He closed his eyes briefly, as though the words themselves carried the mercy he had long denied himself. When he opened them again, there was something unguarded there. A man stripped of titles, left only with regret and possibility. Isabella, he said, her name barely audible, you deserve far more than the shadow I've been. And yet, she replied, a shadow can still offer shelter. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere in the palace, a servant called out, and the spell between them broke. Arthur straightened, remembering who he was supposed to be. I should go, he said. She inclined her head. Of course. But before he turned to leave, he hesitated. His hand reached toward hers, a fleeting gesture, more reverence than touch, then withdrew as though afraid it might burn. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled on the edge of something he could not name. You said silence can be cruel, he murmured. Perhaps I have been its willing accomplice. Then break it, she whispered. He did not answer. Instead, he opened the door and stepped into the dim corridor, the echo of his footsteps fading into the hush of the storm. Isabella remained at the piano, fingers poised above the keys, the melody of his confession still lingering in her mind. She played the song again, softer this time, slower, and for the first time she was not playing to fill the silence. She was playing into it as if the silence itself might listen. Outside, dawn crept faintly over the palace roofs. The snow had ceased, leaving the world washed clean, fragile, expectant. In the west wing, Arthur stood by his window watching the faint glow from her chamber. He did not know why the sound of her music, felt like forgiveness. And far below, a servant hurried down the corridor carrying a sealed envelope addressed to the prince, its wax unbroken, the same crest of intertwined letters, E and A glinting faintly beneath the candlelight. The letter was never meant to be opened, yet the seal was broken before dawn. Arthur found it on his desk, its wax shattered like a promise too brittle to survive the night. The handwriting was unmistakable, Evangeline's. His breath caught. The room swayed slightly as though the very air recoiled from memory. He sat, hands trembling, and unfolded the yellowed parchment. My love, if this reaches you, then I am gone. But know this, nothing in death frightens me except the thought that you will forget how to feel. The words blurred. The ink had faded, but the voice within them was alive, cruelly alive. Arthur pressed the letter to his lips, his heart thudding with a pain that felt both ancient and immediate. For 3 years he had told himself that love, once buried, stayed buried. But now, like an unquiet ghost, it stirred. He rose abruptly, knocking over a glass. Water bled across the desk, soaking the parchment. He froze, then gathered the letter as if cradling a wound. Forget how to feel. The phrase struck him with the force of accusation. Had he not done precisely that? Down the corridor, Isabella's music drifted faintly, the same melody from last night, slower, almost hesitant. He closed his eyes. For one fragile moment, the grief that had defined him and the hope that terrified him met in the hollow of his chest. He left the room. Isabella had not slept. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in her thoughts. She played softly, not for practice but for courage. The notes trembled beneath her fingers. When the door opened, she startled, and the melody faltered into silence. Arthur stood there, the faintest pallor beneath his eyes, a letter clutched in his hand. Forgive me, he said. I had to see you. She rose, uncertain. Has something happened? He looked at the paper, then at her. Something long dead has decided to live again. She waited, sensing the weight of his words. This was Evangeline's, he said. It arrived this morning. I do not know who sent it or why now. He handed it to her. She hesitated, then read quietly. Her eyes softened. She loved you dearly. She knew me too well, he murmured. Even in farewell, she saw the man I would become, and tried to save me from it. Isabella folded the letter carefully as though it belonged to both their griefs. Perhaps she has in her way. He studied her face. Do you believe the dead can forgive? I believe the living can make forgiveness worth their memory. Arthur turned away, pacing once before speaking again. You must think me weak, clinging to ghosts when the living suffer my distance. I think you human, she said. He laughed softly, bitterly. Humanity has been no virtue in kings. It is merely the permission to fail. She stepped closer. And yet failure teaches what pride cannot. He looked at her then, really looked. You have a way of turning my shame into wisdom. I have lived long enough to know they are sometimes the same. The faintest smile ghosted across his lips. You are kinder to me than I deserve. Kindness is not earned, she replied. It is given, or it isn't kindness at all. He said nothing, but the silence between them grew thick with something unnamed, not romance, not yet, but recognition of shared solitude. That evening the palace was restless. Servants whispered of carriages arriving from the capital, of letters sealed with the royal council's crest. Isabella heard fragments of rumor as she walked through the corridors. The prince is to be summoned. The queen mother demands an heir. A new alliance must be forged. When she reached the balcony overlooking the courtyard, she saw Arthur below, speaking with Lord Ramil, his mother's advisor, the court serpent in velvet gloves. Their conversation was low, tense. The wind carried only scraps of it, necessary for stability. Appearances must be mended. She is unsuitable. She did not need to hear her name to know. When they parted, Arthur looked up, his gaze finding her as though drawn by instinct. For an instant neither moved. Then he turned away, shoulders heavy with a decision already made for him. Night fell. Isabella sat by her window, watching the lamps flicker across the distant bridge. A knock came, light, hesitant. Come in, she said. Arthur entered, without guards, without title. Only weariness followed him. I have something to tell you, he said quietly. The council has spoken. They want the marriage annulled. She felt the words before she understood them. On what grounds? None that matter. They claim it was never consecrated before the archbishop's death. They will rewrite the law if they must. And you? She asked, steady. He hesitated. I told them no. Then why do you look as if you've already agreed? He sank into a chair, his composure fracturing. Because refusal comes with cost. They will strip me of command. The throne will pass to my cousin. Would that grieve you? It would destroy what remains of my father's name. I swore to preserve it. She crossed the room, standing beside him. And yet you would lose yourself to keep his memory alive? He looked up at her, the anguish of a man who had fought too long against his own heart. What would you have me do? Choose what still breathes, she said. Not what's already buried. Her words fell between them like a candle's flame, small but unignorable. He rose slowly. You think love can survive such sacrifice? I think love is made of it. Their eyes met, the kind of gaze that rewrites truth without speaking it. For one suspended moment, time bowed to them. Then a knock shattered it. Lord Ramil entered without waiting for permission. His voice was syrup over steel. Your Highness, the Queen Mother requests your presence. Urgently. Arthur straightened, all tenderness vanishing behind the mask of duty. Tell her I will come. Ramil inclined his head, but his eyes flicked toward Isabella, cold and knowing. It is not fitting for the lady to remain in your chambers at this hour. Arthur's jaw tightened. She is my wife. Ramil's tone sharpened. For now. The door closed behind him, leaving silence raw as a wound. Arthur turned to her. You see what they will make of this. Then let them, she said softly. The truth will not change. He stared at her, at the calm defiance, the quiet grace that had undone him more than any rebellion could. Then he did something he had never done before. He took her hand. Not in command but in plea. If I cannot protect you, he whispered, will you hate me for trying? I could never hate what loves me in silence, she said. He held her hand a moment longer, then released it as though surrendering something sacred. Later, when the palace slept, Isabella found the letter again, Evangeline's, left forgotten on the piano. The candlelight trembled over its closing line. Do not let the world make you loveless, Arthur. She folded it and pressed it to her chest. Outside, the bells tolled 3 times, the hour before dawn. In the west wing, a servant raced through the corridor, shouting for the guards. The Queen Mother had collapsed. And in her hand, clenched tightly even in death, was a second letter, addressed to her son, bearing Isabella's name. The palace bells tolled before dawn, slow, deliberate, and merciless. Arthur stood beside his mother's bed, the air thick with rosewater and grief. The Queen Mother's stillness was almost regal. Even in death she commanded the room. In her right hand, clutched tight against her chest, lay the sealed letter marked with Isabella's name. No one dared touch it. The courtiers whispered that her last words had been a curse, Others said a confession. Arthur said nothing. "Send everyone away," he ordered at last, his voice low and hollow. The attendants bowed and withdrew until the chamber was silent. Only then did he approach the bedside, his hands trembling as he reached for the letter. The seal broke easily, too easily, and the faint scent of lavender drifted up, his mother's scent. The letter was brief. "My son, forgive the cruelty that sought to save you. The girl they forced upon you is not your enemy but your redemption. Do not repeat my sin. I loved once and buried it beneath a crown. Do not bury yours." Arthur's vision blurred. The parchment slipped from his fingers. All his life he had been his mother's creation, the image of restraint, the weapon of duty. Yet her final act was to unmake him, to leave him standing in the ruins of every justification he had ever used to keep his heart guarded. He sank into the nearest chair, the storm within him breaking its long silence. Isabella heard the news an hour later. The maid who delivered it trembled, unsure how to speak of queens and sudden deaths. Isabella listened without a word, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt sorrow, yes, but also a strange aching foreboding. For death in the royal court was never merely death, it was politics wrapped in mourning cloth. By noon the corridors swarmed with officials. The council convened in the Hall of Mirrors, a chamber whose beauty had long disguised its cruelty. Isabella stood at the edge, a silent ornament to the gathering of men who would decide her fate. Lord Ramil rose, voice smooth and deliberate. "Her Majesty's passing demands stability. We cannot afford distraction, or controversy." His eyes flicked toward Isabella. "His Highness must confirm the annulment before the funeral rites." A murmur rippled through the hall. Arthur, seated at the head, said nothing. Ramil pressed on. "It is the late Queen's wish, recorded and witnessed by this council." Arthur's gaze was cold. "You lie. Your Highness." "She left me a letter," Arthur said. "Her wish was not division but forgiveness." The room stilled. Ramil recovered quickly. "With respect, Your Highness, grief may cloud your interpretation." Arthur stood. "I have lived long enough in my mother's shadow to recognize her truth when I see it. This council forgets its place." Gasps followed. Ramil paled but kept his composure. "Then you defy your own council?" "I defy the ghosts that keep us loveless." For a moment, silence hung, then Arthur's voice softened, yet carried the weight of finality. "Lady Isabella remains my wife. Henceforth, she is to be addressed as Princess Consort, by my decree and by my choice." Ramil's jaw tightened. "And the throne, Your Highness?" Arthur met his gaze. "Let it belong to one who values power more than peace. I have no wish to rule without heart." That night, the palace dimmed beneath mourning drapery. Arthur found Isabella in the east wing, standing by the window where she had once been exiled. Her hair was unbound, her face calm in the candlelight. When he entered, she turned, uncertain whether the man before her was husband or stranger. "You heard," he said quietly. "I heard everything," she replied. "The council, the decree, your defiance. And what do you make of it?" She studied him a long moment. "It is not defiance I see. It is freedom, the kind that frightens men who have never lived honestly." He moved closer, the grief and exhaustion on his face softening beneath her gaze. "I was cruel to you, Isabella. I wore my sorrow like armor, and you met every blade of it with grace. I do not deserve your kindness." "You mistake me," she said gently. "Kindness is not what you owe, it is what you allow." He exhaled, the words catching. "You make everything sound so simple." "It isn't," she said. "But it becomes simple once the truth is spoken." He hesitated, then reached into his coat and drew out the letter. "My mother's last words. She saw you as I should have." Isabella took it, her eyes glistening as she read. "Then she was not your enemy either." "No," he whispered. "Only my mirror." They stood together in silence. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, soundless, merciful. Arthur spoke again, quieter now. "Tomorrow they will strip my title. I will no longer be prince nor heir. Will you still stand beside me when the gold fades?" She smiled faintly. "I did not marry the gold, Arthur. I married the man beneath it, though he took his time revealing himself." He laughed, unguarded, the sound raw and human. "You have a way of healing wounds I did not know I carried." "Then let them heal," she said. "You've bled long enough for ghosts." He took her hands, his eyes burning with something unspoken, a vow reborn. "From this night, you are not the woman sent to my chamber out of duty. You are the reason I finally learned how to feel." The words hung between them, fragile and sacred. She did not reply, she only stepped forward, resting her forehead lightly against his chest. For the first time he did not flinch. The next morning, London awoke to two shocks: the Queen Mother's funeral announcement and the news that Prince Arthur had renounced his claim. The newspapers called it madness, a scandal, a love story doomed by sentiment. But within the palace gates, the truth was simpler, and far quieter. A carriage left the courtyard at dawn, unmarked, bearing no crest. Inside, Arthur and Isabella sat side by side, hands entwined. Neither spoke as the city receded behind them, its spires swallowed by mist. When the wheels reached the bridge, Isabella turned to him. "Where will we go?" "Where they cannot tell us who to be," he said. "Someplace where the world ends and begins again." She smiled faintly. "And what will they write of us when the gossip fades?" He looked out at the rising sun. "They will say the prince who would not love became the man who could." The wind carried his words into the distance, the final echo of a kingdom that had once bound them in silence. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the sound of a pianoforte lingered, the same melody that had begun it all, now played freely at last.